How's it going? I hope this podcast finds you well. Maybe it's a Tuesday afternoon in July. 4th of July was a couple of weeks ago. You're just sitting at your desk in your office right now, wondering what the fuck is going on with your life. You're trying. You want to play music, but you got a day job. Look, I get it. I'm not judging you. I understand where you're coming from. It might not be any fun, though. Or maybe you're on a plane ride to jolly old England and you're going to art school, leaving behind everything that you know. Or maybe you're just running your errands somewhere in Spain. Either way, I really appreciate you tuning in today's episode. We got Nick Movshon, which is unbelievable. I can't believe that I was able to do this. I have been a huge fan of his since I was in high school. I kind of discovered his bass playing after getting into James Jamerson, Duck Dunn, Carol Kay, all of the classic session bass players. And I really feel like Nick is a continuing of that lineage. I didn't say that on the episode because I feel like he would have rejected that, and I didn't want to embarrass him or anything. I was already fangirling hard enough over the fact that he was on, but he's such a great bass player. I first remember hearing Back to Black, that record, and not really getting it at the time because there was nothing else out that sounded like that. And then as I kind of got into later high school and started diving more into Minahan Street Band and then getting into the Black Keys and hearing him tell the story about touring with the Black Keys and how his relationship with Dan and Pat started and transitioning into playing with the Arcs with Dan and recording on Easy Eye and doing all that was really, really cool and super exciting. Because I never would have thought in a million years that I would have done this, because he doesn't really do interviews. So that was really cool, too. I had always been digging, and to my knowledge, this is the only long-form interview that's out there of him. But before we get into the podcast, I want to tell you about a really badass horror movie that I saw over the weekend. It's this movie called Late Night with the Devil. I don't know if you've seen a trailer for it. It had a limited release. It stars David, I think his last name is Dashmalchian. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm fucking it up. But it's really fantastic. It's an original idea. It's a found footage movie that is supposed to be a live broadcast on Halloween night, I think 1977. And David plays a late night host named Jack Delroy. And his show is called Night Owls. And on the show, he has on a clairvoyant, a skeptic, and then a paranormal parapsychologist. I think that's what it's called. But this girl that she has been studying, who she also has guardianship over, was in a satanic cult, and she was the only survivor of a mass suicide that happened. And they bring her onto the show, and it gets weird because she's like possessed and shit. But super original idea. Go and check this movie out. I went opening night. I had been looking forward to seeing this film since I heard the premise because I thought it was really original. And I'm not usually into demonic possession for horror movies. Like my genre is definitely zombies. That's probably my favorite. I'm really into that, which I've talked about on previous episodes. But I really thought this movie was super strong and a very original idea, very Lynchian kind of ending. But yeah, if you get the chance, go out and support it in the theater. Or alternatively, you can wait until April 19th until it's streaming on Shudder, but that's pretty cool. Before the episode plays, I wanted to play a song that I wrote called Brutality Clause by me, the Poptimist, the namesake of the podcast. This song was really influenced by the films of S. Craig Zahler, in particular, Dragged Across Concrete. I had gotten really into his movies, and I just thought Brutality Clause sounded like a title of one of his movies, even though his titles are usually way longer. But yeah, here it is. Brutality Clause by me, the Poptimist. We got Nick Movshon today. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
My pleasure. Quite well, thank you. Happy to be doing it.
Yeah, for sure. So you have kind of like a long history and you've played with a ton of artists, but I want to start back at the very beginning for you. Like, where did you start with music at? What is your earliest musical memory?
My earliest musical memory was probably, for better or for worse, my dad playing a Wagner symphony.
Okay.
Which is pretty heavy. My dad played a ton of classical music around the house. So I think probably the first piece of music I ever remember hearing that sort of imprinted anything on me was probably like Ride of the Valkyries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for better or for worse. So,
Yeah.
I like kind of like Full Tilt Drama from, that's like, I wouldn't know how old I was. I don't know, 3 or 4, something like that. But that's the first one for sure.
Did you have any musicians in your family?
Not musicians that were, I had a lot of people who were involved in the arts. Like my grandfather was a was an opera critic for the Times. My father is a sort of a lover of classical music. My mother is a good piano player and singer, but never pursued it in even any kind of even amateurish fashion. So I had a lot of music enthusiasm in the house, but none of my immediate family had any formal musical training or played musical instruments on a regular basis in the house. No.
When did you start playing music?
Um, I took, sort of rudimentary piano lessons and played like the clarinet and did a few other things, probably starting in third or fourth grade, something like that. But that was in the context of school. My parents didn't send me to, private lessons or conservatory or anything. I went to a school which had a good musical program, and I basically was stuck with a clarinet in my hand, which I didn't enjoy very much, but that's what I was assigned. So I started with that kind of stuff. Yeah.
When did bass come into the picture?
I started playing bass when I was 11. And I actually requested it, which was weird. Like for whatever reason, I was drawn to it. And I remember like asking my parents when maybe I was 12, but I said, I want to get a bass. And both of them were kind of like, you want to get a bass? And I was like, yeah, I want to get a bass. I would really like to play bass. And I remember they went, I went to 48th Street where all the old music stores in Manhattan used to be. It was just like, endless row of music stores, which are now most of them are gone, and bought like they bought me like a Mexican P bass, which I like dropped in the store. Like the whole thing was like kind of a disaster, but that was like my first good instrument or first instrument. I got that when I was 11 and started taking private lessons, and that was kind of the start of it.
So what excited you about the bass? Was there a particular bass player or a song or something like that that got you interested?
I would I can't remember a specific thing. I mean, I remember there were bass lines once I started that I was like, oh shit, this is really cool. There was a song by a British sort of one-hit wonder band from the 90s called Space Hog, called In the Meantime, where like the dude played a Rickenbacker and had this like amazing, really, really good melodic line. I remember like that sticking out. But no, it's like I was listening to like jazz records and stuff. So you know what, actually something like the bass intro to like um So What or something like that. I remember stuff like that sort of resonating with me. But it wasn't like I heard like I don't know what a good example. It's not like I heard like My
Victor
Generation or
Wooten.
like I certainly not Victor Wooten, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I definitely I didn't gravitate even towards players like Flea so much. Like I was like listening to like jazz stuff and then maybe listening to like more like rock things. So maybe there was something. I mean, maybe it was actually something like fairly like sort of mainstream pop music. Something like there were a couple of, like the Green Day songs that had like really really cool sort of
Prominent
involving bass.
bass.
Yeah, and I was like, oh that's cool. My 11 or 12-year-old self when those records came out, I was like, oh, those are really cool. But it wasn't something where it's like I heard a bass line and then I was like, oh shit, I want to play bass. Like I was just sort of it was I don't know. It was like it was like a I don't know what motivated me to do it. And my parents were like, you didn't have a very good explanation. You were just like, oh, I want to play bass. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, I'd say it ended up working out for you.
Yeah, it's been all right. It's been okay.
Uh, how did you meet Homer and Leon and all those guys?
So I went to a Quaker private school in downtown Manhattan, um, from a very young age, from like kindergarten, did my whole way through there until I went to high school. And Homer and Leon both came in like sort of two successive years, I think in seventh and eighth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up in the jazz band together. So like Homer was playing drums and I was playing shitty bass and Leon was playing saxophone. And we had a really really wonderful jazz teacher, sort of like music department head, who has actually fostered a whole bunch of really interesting talent over the years. But he was a really really sort of an enthusiastic figure, and he really encouraged us to start doing the stuff that we did. So yeah, we started playing. I guess we sounds weird. So we started playing when we were like 13, so junior high
Wow.
school. Yeah.
Well, I think for a bass player, when you have a consistent drummer to play with when you're young, it's so crucial because it really develops your sense of the living and breathing aspect of being in a rhythm section.
Yeah. No, and I was exceedingly lucky. I mean, obviously, like at that age, our skills were a lot more rudimentary, like we weren't like very good musicians, but Homer and I particularly, like we had a similar, I don't know, a similar aesthetic sensibility, which was maybe a little sophisticated for our age and was also removed from a lot of what a lot of people were like obsessed with. It was like we were like 13 and we were listening to like soul jazz records, and then we were listening to more like, we were like listening to like the harder early James Brown records when everybody was like starting to get into P-funk and stuff. And we'd be listening to all this like, people would be listening to like Flashlight and we'd be like, oh, this is cool. And then we'd hear like I Got the Feeling, and both of us would just be like, this is the most insane thing I've ever heard. And we had a sort of, unspoken simpatico and stuff like that. And that was very beneficial to basically have your longest standing rhythm section partner be on the same page with you. And want to start kind of exploring that stuff. It's probably very beneficial in the long term for us,
Absolutely. Were you guys playing together outside of school, or was this something that was just in school?
We played in school. I remember we recorded, we tromped up to some studio outside of Woodstock because Leon had grown up upstate, and then his folks were from the city, and he moved back into the city and came to our school, but his folks knew all sorts of people. So I remember we went up to like a kind of like cracked out studio somewhere outside of Woodstock and recorded like a demo when we were maybe in the summer between 8th and 9th grade. And that was the
Oh,
first
wow.
yeah, that was the first thing we like formally recorded. And then yeah, no, but certainly by the time that we were in high school, we were playing live shows with like some regularity, and like the kind of whole format and like what kind of thing we were doing was changing quite quickly. But yeah, we were playing live certainly by the time we were like 15.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay. And in New York City.
in New York City.
So what was it like back then? I'm guessing this was what, like late 90s?
Yeah, so we were all born in 82 and we started playing shows. Sorry, let me do the math here. It's not my strong point anymore. But yeah, we probably played like our first shows at like a club, which was, something where they didn't pay us, and it was just all of our friends, and it was just like, whatever your gate was that you bring, you get paid for, and they wouldn't even give you that. Probably in like 1996. And
Okay.
there was a sort of variety. There were like a number of shitty clubs in Manhattan that would cater to sort of that more like teenage audience. And then there was also the thing that we got into, which was, I guess you could call it like the developing scene in Williamsburg, where there were venues that were much more non-conventional venues, but were populated with the kind of people who were mostly older than us, but had closer sensibilities to what we were doing. And then we kind of got more looped into that, which became fruitful in a whole variety of different ways. But yeah, we were playing like our base before we kind of figured out what we were doing. We were playing, little kiddie shows with all our like ninth and 10th grade
Friends.
friends,
Yeah.
playing like, like obnoxiously funky covers of like Crosstown Traffic and shit like that. Like playing like some cool stuff and maybe some originals, but like not really dialed in yet. But we were doing it.
When did you guys start the Mighty Imperials, or was this like the first iteration of it?
I mean, it was basically the same lineup. Um, what what happened was we were still more in the world where we were kind of like aping like more like P-funky kind of stuff, like the sort of like, I mean, what you think of as more being like sort of like party funk, or like maybe like later meters, not like hard shit, certainly not stuff that was taking away from like early meters, and more like sort of like rare funk 45 stuff. And then through some odd circumstances, Leon gave a saxophone lesson to the younger sister of a friend of ours in school, who happened to be like, they were the daughters of the drummer from Bad Company, Simon Kirke. And Simon and Simon's wife knew this eccentric French guy named Philip Lehman, who was a scion of the Lehman banking family, but was a really, really prominent like Parisian graffiti artist, and then was one of the first guys who had started both sort of vociferously collecting and compiling and releasing compilations of all the Funk 45 stuff, that was still not really there. And he had partnered up with Gabe Roth, who went on to run Desco and Daptone, Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of like, I remember we made like a little demo in Homer's house. Homer had very musical parents, so they had like a little sort of music room at the top of their house, and they had like a 4-track. And basically these two guys were like, yo, give us a demo, and like we can record something. And we had been recording all this like garbage P-Funk stuff, but they were like, make us a demo like this. And they gave us a tape which had all these like real cornerstone, rare funk 45s on it. And we basically listened to that stuff and copped it. And we did like a James Brown cover, and we did a couple of like Metersy kind of songs and maybe one other thing, and put it on a tape and gave it to those guys. And they were like, we got a studio on West 41st Street right next to the Lincoln Tunnel, right by Port Authority. Come through and we'll record. And so when we were, I think we were 16, we went and like recorded like the first Mighty Imperials 45 with them. Yeah. So we were quite young. I mean, we were like 16, I think, when we were the first one.
Well, there's something kind of serendipitous because you guys have had such great success and you play in all these bands together. And it's just kind of crazy to think about that so much of it is just like partially it was due to the time that you were born in, the neighborhood that you were born in, that you ended up going to school with these guys and developing great musical chemistry with them.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it kind of like, I don't think about it that much because I'm still living it. I'm lucky enough that these guys are still really like my best friends and my closest musical collaborators, even though we do lots of things apart. Like, I mean, for nearly 30 years at this point, like we've just been kind of making music together. And I sometimes forget, but when I actually try to put a little bit of objectivity on my situation, I'm just like, wow, how many people had the opportunity to do this? Like meeting people when they were in junior high school and being in the right place in the right time and being into the right shit and meeting the right people and being able to sort of mine this very, at that point, very, very sort of obscure vein of music and both be able to do it in some capacity when we were kids, and then also having that spiral into all the other stuff we eventually got into and I got into and stuff. So yeah, no, I mean, it's unlikely. It's an unlikely sequence of events that managed to come together in a very serendipitous way, you know.
Have you ever read Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
I've read other Malcolm Gladwell books. I've never read Outliers.
So Outliers, he talks about like firstly the 10,000 hour rule. It takes 10,000 hours to master any craft.
Is that where that idea comes from, that Gladwell book?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean I've heard it. It's just like a thing that's out in the ether now where people talk about the 10,000 hours thing. But one of the things he talked about was in the book was Bill Gates and how he was at a school in Washington State, and it was like one of the first schools in the US that got a computer at it. And it just so happened to be at Bill Gates's school. He also talks about the Beatles and them kind of the way that they met and how they were playing in Hamburg, you know, in the strip clubs in Germany, and kind of logging in their time. And it sounds like it's a very similar story to what you guys have.
I will say there's one caveat, and this is something which maybe some people will be surprised about, although I don't know, maybe like we've never been particularly diligent. We never fucking rehearsed that much or anything. Like we were much more interested in like going and hang out and like smoking weed on stoops and like making mixtapes and stuff. I mean, like we played, but you know, talking about that whole thing about just like the diligence of like going in and practicing and like refining our art, like we were always just like one and done. We were like whatever. And I suppose you could say that, oh, that's like a little bit like a sort of like a DIY kind of punk thing, but we were never in that headspace. But we were much more like that. We didn't care about we were just like, yeah, just do it and be done with it. Yeah, it's cool. But I guess if you do that enough, then eventually, maybe one day I'll reach 10,000 hours. Maybe when I'm in my 60s, I'll finally reach my 10,000 hours, and then truly I'll have achieved my Gladwellian ideal, you know. But yeah.
When did you meet Tommy? Did he go to school with you guys as well?
No, Tommy was from Staten Island, so And I know that sounds like so whatever, but I mean, it's like we were like downtown Manhattan kids. Tommy and all the dudes who ended up being in the Budos, or at least the initial thing in the Budos, they were in Staten Island and knew about all the stuff that was happening, like the Desco records. And then there was also bands like Antibalas, which I played bass in for a while, and then the kind of early Sharon Jones stuff and all the stuff that was happening with Desco records, like Sugarman 3, bands like this. And they basically caught wind of it and started like submitting demos to Gabe Roth and his partner Philip. I mean, really, actually, Philip was out of the picture at that point. But then they started kind of coming through the shows that we were playing, which we were already playing with some regularity. And at that point, we, Homer and Leon and I had actually shifted and we're kind of had like leveled up, and we're playing some of like the sort of bigger bands in our little scene. So Tommy started coming through. I probably met Tommy when I was 18, maybe 17. So that happened later. That happened in sort of like the tail end of high school, but again, still quite early in someone's like musical trajectory, and another relationship that's proven to be really durable, and a guy I've made a ton of music with, Dave Guy as well, who's the trumpet player, who he grew up. He's like a few years older than us, and he grew up on like it's ridiculous. He grew up on like ninth and second, and went to a slightly different school. So we didn't meet him until like he was 21 and we were 18 or something. But again, like a lot of these like very, very important sort of like core musical relationships were formed certainly before we were old enough to drink, like we were
Wow.
kids. Yeah.
Yeah, that is pretty insane. When did you guys link up with Mark Ronson?
So the horn players in the Dap Kings were brought in by Mark as session players on one of his early solo records, and suitably impressed him with what they did. And then when he got the opportunity to produce the Amy Winehouse record, which like was in 2005 or 2006,
Back to Black.
Back to Black, he was like, oh, well, these guys, the Dap Kings, at least like Sharon Jones, the Dap Kings are like, those are the dudes who can help me achieve this sound. Because at that point, it's like in 2023, there's like a million fucking bands that can play like that, right? It's like that, like what we do has like kind of become part of the lexicon with a couple of successive generations of musicians, whether it's self-taught or going through, like the Berkeley washing machine or whatever. But at that point, we were like kind of the only guys who could do it. So Mark hit us up. And it was kind of only by chance that I actually played on that record, because not by chance, but Gabe, who's the nominal bass player in the Dap Kings, was engineering. So he was like, shit, who else can do this? And he's like, well, Nick's the only other guy who can play like this. So that's how I ended up on that record.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't one of these things where it's like, I got the call and I was like, oh my God, like, it's incredible he's asking me. It's like, Gabe was like my like musical mentor. So it made like perfect sense. He called me up and he's like, dude, would you mind doing this? Like, I have to engineer. And I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. Great. And that was the first time that we all worked in a full band context with Mark.
That's really badass. Yeah. So were you using the Gibson Ripper on that?
I was playing my Gibson Ripper on that.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's kind of the bass. I've honestly I've been a fan for so long, but I remember a lot of early videos of you playing that Ripper mostly.
Yeah.
What is it about that bass that's different from a P bass?
Different from a P bass. So that bass, I'll even take that one step further. That particular Gibson Ripper is different from every other Ripper I've ever played. Like I think I own 4 of them.
Oh,
and
wow.
And I've modded them in the same way that one showed up to me. And none of them are like even in the same ballpark as that bass. So the whole deal with that bass is, unlike a P bass, it's got 2 pickups, right? It's got 2, I guess they're humbuckers, right? They're not like I guess they're kind of jazz style pickups, but they're in like, it's like a Gibson looking thing. And on the face of it, you're like, okay, it's got 3 knobs and it's got a selector. But no, Gibson completely fucked them up out of the factory, at least in my perspective, where the bass is shipped from the factory with I'm not sure if you've ever seen the rotary knobs.
Yeah.
Right. So those basses wired from the factory, you can't just get the neck pickup by itself, and you can't just get the bridge pickup by itself. It's all series. It's like in parallel, out of phase, in phase. It's all this like fancy stuff where they were trying to get all these like hi-fi sounds, and the knobs actually aren't, you don't think they don't do what you think they do. Like one of them's a volume, one of them's like a mid cut, and one of them's like a bass boost. It's like, it's a stupid,
Interesting.
right, stupid ass layout, at least for the kind of music. At least in my
Yeah.
opinion, works for some people, worked for Rick Danko, you know, so it's like, it's
Yeah.
not terrible. But the one that I got, unbeknownst to me, at some point in the deep dark history, someone had like torn it apart and just rewired it with a three-way switch. So it was just like neck, middle, bridge. So it was wired in a normal fashion. And yeah, I just, you know, I got the bass and it was just like, oh, neck position. I was like, this sounds amazing, you know? And I'd actually, the first cool bass I'd ever bought was actually another 70s Gibson, which I still have and I still play sometimes, which was the budget version of the SG bass from the early 70s. It was called
Is it the EBO or the EB3?
actually called an SB 400. It
Oh, interesting.
looks like an SG, but same body as an SG. But instead of the, you know, the what do they call it? The mudbucker, the enormous pickup that's in the front of the EBOs. It's got these two weird little single coil pickups, like cheap hardware, cheap switching stuff. It was designed as a budget instrument, but I picked that up when I was like, that's the bass I used on like the Mighty Imperials record. I got the bass when I was like 16. And again, it was just like, this bass sounds weird, but it sounds really fucking good. And then I got the opportunity to get the Ripper from a friend of mine. And I got that bass and I was like, oh, this is like the one I already had, but it's even better. And yeah, that was like my main bass for years and years. It was the main bass that I played. And I mean, I still have it and I still play it sometimes, but I, you know, for a while, it was like, that was like the one, you know.
What kind of amp were you using on that session, or were you going DI?
No, I think at that time in Daptone, there was one of those 70s Fender Bassmans, which are 4x10 combos, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
10-inch speakers, not a very powerful amp, maybe a 50 or a 70 watt. It's like, I think
Blackface?
Silverface. I mean, they were like
Oh,
shitty amps, or at
yeah.
least shitty amps, but not like a desirable. You know, it wasn't like the, you know, like a blonde 60s bassman, like super cool vibey, you know, 60s amp. That with a DI, I think Gabe was using RE20s. You know, so it was just like a mix of a DI signal and that bass through that bass amp. So nothing fancy, you know, just like a bass that sounds cool and an amp that sounds cool, like
Hey,
mic'd
it's all in
musically.
the hands.
Yeah, and also, I mean, like, I got to give respect where respect is due. I mean, Gabe Roth is like, he's the fucking man. He's like, you know, he's like one of the dudes. He's such a good musical engineer, and you know, so yeah, the bass sounds good. And I was like, at that point, I mean, like, I wasn't like that good at that point. You know, it's like I could like play songs and I could play arrangements, and I was playing with dudes that I played with for a long time, so we could sound like a band and we had the right influences. But in terms of like my like sophistication as a player, like, it wasn't that high. But we did what we were supposed to do in the context of the song, and it was like captured well and then mixed well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you using rounds or flats back then?
That bass came to me with the gnarliest rusted out rounds.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and I left them on there because they sounded so good.
I would not have guessed rounds.
No, both of my early Gibsons, they came with rounds when I got them, and I was just like, I mean, I didn't really know, and I was just like, this is cool. And I played both of those basses with those strings on them. Actually, I think about my SG bass, the same round rounds are still on there. And
Wow.
they still sound okay. The Ripper had round wounds on it, really disgusting. I mean, literally like rotting round wound strings that eventually got so bad with the intonation that I could only intonate the bass about a 5-fret thing. Otherwise,
Yeah.
by my standards, was like so out of tune that it was just like, oh, I can't even play this. And that was one of the reasons why I eventually retired it, along with like, it needed new frets and I had moved on to other stuff. But yeah, really, really disgusting old round wounds of unknown provenance. I have no idea what they were.
Did you at a certain point switch over to flats or discover flats?
I I started basically what happened was I started buying basses in maybe like 15 years ago. Like I went for years with having like a couple of basses and just using a couple of basses and being very happy. And then all of a sudden I did the thing, which I think happens to a lot of guys, especially if they have access to being like kind of on the inside and getting good deals on things and all that sort of stuff. Like I just started buying shit. And what would happen is I would buy things like, I'd buy on the face like very cool basses, which have gone on to be very, very useful basses, like 60s P basses and stuff. And they would show up, or I'd buy them and they'd have like brand new round ones on them. I'd be like, this sounds like shit, you know? And it was at that point where I was like, oh, I'll take these round wound strings that are new. And I mean, and I'm not kidding. I used to do this all the time, like bury them in my garden for 3 weeks and bring them out, or cover them in animal fat or whatever. And that wouldn't necessarily achieve the goal. And then I started buying dead stock flat wounds on eBay, and putting together sets of kind of equivalent gauge strings. So it's like the bass that was my main bass after that, which is super cool, like 1969 Precision. It's a Sunburst 69 Precision, most straightforward bass in the world, but a really, really good one. That still to this day has a completely mismatched set of eBay purchased dead stock flats, which are
Were
like
they just
all of
old flats?
yeah, there's old flats, like literally, like like case. People are like, people would sell them as like, hey, get your Fender case candy, and I'd be like, do they have the strings in them? The guy's like, you want the strings? I was like, give me the fucking strings. And so I'd get
Yeah.
the strings, and I'd find ones that weren't either completely dead or wouldn't break as you put them on the bass, and kind of match them. And I defaulted to that kind of logic with my basses because it was the easiest way to get kind of close to what I had with the rippers with the really destroyed rounds. So I would basically,
Interesting.
I know it's kind of backwards. And then beyond that, what I started doing was, and what I basically do all the time now is I just get pyramids. I just get pyramids.
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 Nice.
Pyramids are the fucking best.
I've never tried pyramids. I got into playing flats probably about maybe 12 or 13 years ago. I had bought this jazz bass in my hometown. I grew up in Maine, and there's like a little music store downtown. I grew up in a very idyllic, whatever the vision is of Maine, that's where I grew up.
Up in that, yeah.
But there was this little music store that I had been going to since I was a kid, and the owner knew I was like serious about playing music and playing bass, and I had just had a couple of like shitty Squire basses up until this point, but there was a 65 jazz bass. I had walked in, I'd opened the door, and this guy walked out, and he was the owner and of that bass, and he had gone to trade it in, and I was the next person in the shop. And the owner was like, "Hey, check out that case on the floor."
Serendipity, sir.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
But it was in horrible cosmetic shape. The neck stamp was stamped. Yeah. It was bad, dude. Like it was someone had painted over it with a paintbrush and they had ripped the fender decal.
Yo, I've got a 61 Precision that is covered in shellac.
Really?
It's so cool.
Yeah.
I've talked to a bunch of guys. I'm like, like guys who are really, really knowledgeable, really guys, really real aficionados. And I'm like, I should get this refinned, right? And every single one of them is just like, yo, that's a piece of American history. Some kid did that on acid in 1967. Like, don't touch that bass. It's so
For real.
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. What I ended up doing, well, it had flats on it, and I didn't even know flats were a thing.
Right. So did you pull the flats off?
Well, I played it and I'm like, this is weird. I don't like this. And then I put just like some roto sounds on it or something like that, whatever I could scrounge up to afford.
Right.
And I had those on for maybe like 2 weeks or so, and I was like, I think I like the flat wounds better. And I've been a flat player ever since, and I'm super into labella. That's what I've always used.
Man, labellas sound great. I just like never got along with actually like the ones that I think the really, really heavy tension labellas,
The Jamersons.
the Jamersons, which are like have the 110, like the tree trunk ones, like for whatever reason, like they sound great, but I've like never gotten along with the way they felt for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
But like if they work for you, I mean, that's like a super archetypal sound. I mean, it just like sounds.
Oh yeah. Good. Yeah, no, for sure. 100%.
You still have that bass?
No, dude. So when I moved to Nashville, I had to sell it because I was broke as shit.
It happened.
And I ended up, so I have right there, the bass that's farthest off is really not in good view, but it's a Japanese P bass, Fender P bass from like 2003 or 2004. And the Japanese stuff is phenomenal. And I got it because it's modeled after a 62
Yeah,
Jamerson, of course.
yeah,
And I, as soon as I got it in, like it shipped from Japan. I usually don't buy stuff sight unseen, but I
yeah.
was like, I know this bass has got it. I had just got my tax return back, and I was like, I'm gonna get this bass, and it's been my main bass ever since.
The fact of the matter is, you know, I love vintage instruments. I do my best to acquire them whenever I can for reasonable prices. But like my favorite bass right now is again a crafted in Japan, Japanese domestic market only 1965 jazz black with a black matching headstock. Like same shit. Like Japanese domestic market, like literally bass made like 13 years ago, and I'm just like, this thing rocks.
Yeah.
Fenders are really cool that way, and also Fender guitars are like that too. It's
Mhm.
like, it's like you can make the argument, like, oh, like a 65 Telly is gonna, and there's kind of like they're really magical instruments which are maybe gonna do the thing a step forward, but like it kind of doesn't matter. It's like if the guitar is set up right, the bass is set up right, it doesn't fucking matter if it's a 2015 Japanese market 1962 precision or a 1962 precision. It's like if you got the flats on it, and it's like you know how to play it, it's kind of going to sound the same.
Yeah. Well, last year I had bought one of the JMJ signature Mustangs. Have you ever seen
That's the
those
one.
before?
That's the one you got in the back there, right?
Yeah, that's right next to the upright. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that comes stock with flats. And dude, I love that
Yo,
bass.
fucking Mustangs are so cool. I got a competition stripe. I think it's a 69. That
That's
bass,
cool.
those basses rock. Those basses also in a studio context are great. Like it's like I've run a recording studio for multiple recording studios forever at this point, and it's always good to have a stock of basses in the studio that you can put in the hands of bass players who come into your studio who like don't have a lot of flavor, and like a Mustang with flats is one of those instruments.
Yeah.
Like some dude comes in with like his like 5-string jazz bass with like rounds on it and just sounds like shit in the track. You're just like, just try this. And
It
like
makes them sound superhuman, right?
it just sounds correct. It
Yeah.
says like eight
Yeah.
times out of 10, it's just like, yeah, there you go. And that's like one of like 3 basses which we'll just put in people's hands. We're just like, just give this one a shot. So yeah, Mustangs are awesome. And those are really good. Those are really good too, man. I mean, especially for the price point. I mean, what are they, like $1,400 new or something?
Yeah. Yeah. I was working at GC for a little while, so I was
Yeah.
able to get that employee discount.
That's sick.
Yeah, and they actually I don't know if you've seen it, but they're doing like this Ventera 2 line, which are really cool. They have a couple of Mustangs that are out now. They have one that's competition orange and then Lake Placid blue. So they each have the
Oh,
racing
nice.
stripe on
They're
them.
doing that thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're kind of Mustangs are in vogue right now. They're back. They even have Squire Mustangs now.
I mean, honestly, like I have no issue with that whatsoever. Aesthetically, they're great. They're also really good. I've also found like Mustangs, especially. I mean, I know it's kind of obvious because it's a short scale bass, but it's just like because of the body size and because a lot of guitar players who are used to playing Jags or Jazz Masters or Duosonics or the Mustang guitars, like you often find you stick them in guitar players' hands and they feel much more at home with the instrument than if you fucking stick like a P bass with a big C neck on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and all this, like like really talented guitar players or songwriters or whoever, and it's like you stick a 34-inch scale big thing, and they're
It's
just immediately,
intimidating.
they're just like, ah, but you put a Mustang in their hands, they're just like, oh, this is great because it's kind of the same size,
All my guitar player buddies love it when I bring the Mustang around
right?
because they feel like bass players.
If you like bass players, and you're like,
Yeah.
no, not even close, motherfucker.
Yeah,
You can
exactly.
pretend for 20 minutes, and then you have to give it back and go play some chords.
Yeah, no, for sure. So how did you end up meeting Dan Auerbach?
Um, Dan and Pat had the Mighty Imperials open up for them at a New York gig in like 2008.
Oh
Um,
wow, another serendipitous kind of
well, no, I mean, like
thing.
they, like Dan and Pat are like those dudes. Those dudes like know really good music, right? Those guys have like Dan especially is just like a record freak, and likes a lot of the same kind of music that we do, be it like soul stuff or gospel stuff or like funk stuff, whatever. Like all stuff that's been like making like our musical mind sort of tick for, you know, the better part of a quarter century. And they hit us up and we're just like, yo, do you want to open this show? And we hadn't even played for years, and we were just like, who the fuck are these guys? Like, we didn't really listen to that music that much. And then we did, and it was cool. And then, you know, like, it was just a thing, and then we didn't hear anything for a while, and we didn't even think about it. Like, it was just like an opening gig for like a rock band from Ohio. Like, we didn't really care. And then they put out a record called Brothers in 2010, which was the first record that they made, which they felt would justify having basically auxiliary musicians on, because there was like stuff like Dan was playing bass on every song, and there was
And he's a great bass player.
Yeah, he's a very good bass player. He really is, and usually plays a Mustang. Until I convinced him to buy a 1952 Precision.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Maple neck.
Yeah, like this, you know, like the blonde.
Oh yeah, yes, like the Telecaster pickup.
Exactly, like it looks like a Telecaster. But yeah, no, he had. I mean, he's got a couple of basses. He's got a really cool short scale Carvin, and he's got one of those Mustangs, like a blue competition blue Mustang. And but there was too much shit on that record for them to do the heavy lifting live. So they basically hit us up. And again, we were kind of like, no, we're good. Like, we're good. But then eventually, like, we acquiesced, and then Leon and I went out and did, I don't know, maybe like a year's worth of touring with him. This is like strictly as like sidemen. And it was like fun. And then both of us, like, we got out of that band like right as they were kind of starting to do like, I guess, like arena stuff. And like, Leon dipped out. Leon will occasionally do this. Like, the next album was coming out, and Leon was just like, yeah, I can't do any of this shit, and just kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And I kind of did a couple more things. They were like, okay, we're gonna get another keyboard player. Nick, do you want to continue doing this? And I was like, yeah, I'll stay on. And we did like 3 days of tech rehearsals for these, you know, like the shows in like the much bigger spaces. And I was just like, fuck this, I don't want to do this. I want to be back in New York making records. So we both basically left the second that band was getting really successful. Not that it would have made much difference to us, because we were sidemen and we would be getting paid well, but not like transformationally.
Sure, sure.
But I should say Dan and Pat had hit us up again, because like there's a soul singer named Lee Fields who we played with for years and years and years.
Phenomenal.
Right. So the first record that we did in like our world had come out, and I think Dan especially had heard that and was just like, yo, this is the shit. Like, I want those guys. And from that relationship, even though we stopped playing live with them after 6 months or something, or 9 months or something, basically the studio relationship, or at least it clicked in Dan's mind. And I got to give the man credit, because I mean, he basically wants to make records too. That's his like primary thing. He wants to just record all the time. And Dan realized that having Leon and I, sometimes just Leon, sometimes just me, but mostly us going down together on productions that he was doing would be, you know, beneficial for him. And over the next, I don't know, half decade, 5 or 6 years, like, we made a lot of really cool records. Like, we made a great record with Dr. John, which was still to this day, like, I think one of the coolest recording experiences like I've ever had. Like,
That's a badass record. Lock down.
Yeah, we bullshitted that record in 5 days. We just like completely faked the entire thing, and Dr. John was just like down. And you know, he was a guy that we all held in really high regard, like both like, you know, like the Meters Funky Records, but then also like so we were very happy to do that. And we like, I don't know, we made like records with Lana Del Rey. We made a ton of records with Dan.
Well, one question I have about that Lana Del Rey record. So my favorite song on that is a bonus track, and it's one that you're listed as playing drums on, Florida Kilos. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So are you also a drummer?
I am. I play drums on tons of records. A lot of the records which you probably think Homer is playing drums on, I'm actually playing drums on. Not to take away from yeah, no, a lot of the records, like, I'm playing drums on a lot of shit. That record, basically what happened was, and I don't want to talk too much shit, but I don't really care. Like, Lana's cool, but she is stubborn in the studio. To her credit, like, she was basically walking into a studio situation with like a bunch of like ornery drunk dudes, and, you know, like, held her own and did the whole thing. But the drummer who was on that session initially is a very close friend of Leon and I's, named Max Weisenfeld, who's this German freak show. And he was in like funk bands in Munich in the 90s. He was like ahead of the curve of even us in New York. And he's this like true, like, he like moved to Ghana 5 years ago and opened up a recording studio. He's like that
Oh,
kind of guy. He
wow.
like moved to Ghana with drumsticks. And is, along with Homer and like maybe one or two other guys, like one of the only drummers that I'm really like, have the sort of the very, very deep sort of musical connection with. And Dan had put together the band, and he had brought, it was me and Leon and a couple other people's, Kenny Vaughn, who's just like really sick,
Yeah, Nashville cat.
Nashville guy, a couple of other people, and Max. And after like halfway through the session, Lana just fired Max. It was just like, I think her line was, he's taking too many European liberties with my music. And so he was like sent off packing back to Berlin. And I handled drums and bass duties for basically the rest of the record.
Oh, wow.
I would just like play drums and then overdub bass, or maybe like Dan would play bass while I would play drums, or maybe someone else would cover bass while I was playing drums. But yeah, so I'm playing drums on that song, as well as a bunch of the other shit on that record. But that was totally just like, that was just like circumstantial.
So when did the Arcs come into the picture?
That was like, so when Leon and I stopped playing with the Black Keys, there were a couple of guys that played with them. And then there was a guy named Gus Seifert who was playing bass, and a guy named John Wood who was playing keyboards. And Gus is awesome. He's like an LA bass guy. He's another one of these really, really cool bass player. And they toured for like a year, and then they went their ways. And this guy named Richard Swift started playing bass with the Keys. And Richard, who sadly passed away like 5 years ago, was this just like incredibly talented, incredibly funny, multi-hyphenate musician, producer, artist, singer, songwriter, like truly like the funniest, most talented guy in the room, just to like a comical level all the time. He he and Dan and Leon started like cutting shit a little bit, because they're basically like just, well, actually, no, how did that even happen? I don't know. Dan, we started recording a bunch of shit with Dan for no particular reason. And some of it was with me and Homer and Leon. And some of it was with Dan and Swift. And some of it was all of us. And basically, we recorded a shitload of songs. And then Dan was just like, yo, let's go make a band. Let's go do this. At that point, his relationship with Patrick was maybe not the best, and like the Keys had been touring relentlessly for like 6 years and were like totally burned out. So it was like a fun opportunity for us to like put together sort of a different kind of thing. And I think it was like a breath of fresh air for Dan, and it was really fun for us. And like some of the music is really cool, and like the shows were a lot of fun. But like that band was like never anything more than like a lark, but a lark executed by like basically like a rock star in command who had a lot of resources at his disposal to like make it. It was cool. I mean, like, we didn't make much money, but we had a lot of fun doing it. We had really cool production, and like the band was great, and it was a lot of fun. So yeah.
I saw you guys play at the Ryman here in Nashville, and it was a phenomenal fucking show. My favorite like memory that sticks out was when you guys played Keep on Dreaming, because for the longest time it was just you were playing it live. There was no actual recording of it. And just the girls that were doing the backup, and then Dan singing with them, and kind of the lights all going down in that acidy setup that you had. I don't know what it was.
Kind of drippy, wild, vaguely psychedelic. Yeah.
But it was so badass to kind of see that live, because like my own relationship with the Arcs, I got that 45 of Stay in My Corner and Tomato Can the day it came out, because I think it was also it was coincided with like Record Store Day and the Pacquiao Floyd Mayweather fight.
There was a Pacquiao Mayweather fight. Yeah. And Dan at that point completely obsessed with boxing, so it all kind of like tied in.
But yeah, it was a really badass experience to see you guys live. And I was, of course, super stoked, being a fan of you guys and what you were doing, to then be behind, Dan, and all of you kind of playing in a band together. I thought it was something that was super special to see live.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, no, it was like, yeah, it was funny. It was also like it was like it was like a low stakes, high stakes thing, I guess.
In what
Like,
way?
well, it was just like, I don't want to say like none of us really gave a shit, because I mean we were like, we were like, we were trying to put on a good show and play the music well and all that sort of stuff. But it was like there were no preconceived notions. We knew this wasn't going to be the thing. We didn't need to like do this to like jumpstart our careers and like we're gonna ride this pony into the sunset. We are
Sure.
just like, this is like a fun like side quest, and we're
Yeah.
just gonna kind of like do what we were doing. And it was, it was like a quirky setup. It was like two drummers, and there didn't really need to be two drummers, but we had two fucking drummers just like because.
Yeah.
And like, that sort of situation, it's like, obviously like I hadn't been playing with Dan as long as I've been playing with like Homer and Leon and stuff, but like Dan and I have a very, very sort of strong symbiotic musical bond, and Richard fit into that really well. So it was like deeply enjoyable to like play that music live on stage. And I think by the time that we finished, I mean, we did like, I don't know, maybe 6 months of touring off of it. And I think by the time that we finished doing that touring, everybody was just like, all right, time to go back to our regular jobs, regular lives. But it was fun while it lasted.
So are the Arcs, is that done? Is there any hopes of you guys doing any more
No,
music together?
I could imagine that music may be released under the Arcs moniker at some point in the future, but the decision was basically made. It was like this, when Richard passed away, none of us had any desire whatsoever to like go out and play live or anything.
It
And
wasn't
then
the
when we
same.
released, when that, it's just like, didn't it didn't feel right. It was it wasn't even really discussed. We were just like, yeah, there's no fucking way we're doing this. And the whole thing, the second record that came out was recorded almost entirely before he died. So
Mm-hmm.
we didn't record any music for that. That music was all recorded in like 2016 and
Yeah.
2017. So, and it was just like, I guess you could make the argument that there was like a little bit of like raiding the cupboard for stuff. But it's like there were so many songs recorded. There were like 120 songs recorded or something.
Wow.
Some of which I'm not, most of which, it was like, so there was a whole wealth of material to draw upon. And it was also kind of coincided with the fact that, it's like Dan runs a record label, and he's concerned with like content on his label, and he needs stuff to put out. And you're just like, oh, this is a good opportunity to do cool packaging, have a cool like visual concept behind it. Um there's enough music in the can that we can put together a quality record. I mean, obviously, like, Dan and Leon spent a bunch of time finishing the record and like made it presentable in an album form. But it just kind of made sense to do another one. But there was never any talk of like doing like more live shows. And I don't think there was any enthusiasm on the part of anybody. I mean, basically what happened was like Dan and Leon just did a bunch of DJ things. It was an excuse for them to do like record release parties, and just like,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
it was like, cool. It's like, good. This is going to be like the promo for it. It's like, you don't need to get all the production together. Don't need to like figure out how to play all these fucking songs. Don't have to figure out how to awkwardly replace the guy who died, which nobody
Yeah. No, for sure. Imagine that's kind of a tough road to go down. Well, yeah, man, dude, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for doing this. I feel like there's so much more we could have got into between Charles Bradley and all of that. But
there's always a lot.
yeah. One more question, actually two more. So one, is there any hopes of Minahan Street Band doing any kind of tour in the future?
I mean, we'll play shows.
Okay.
Yeah, well I mean, like that's kind of like, that's like, that's like the dudes, that's like us. It's
Yeah.
like, yes, we'll probably make another record, and we'll probably release it, and we'll probably play some shows. I mean, the likelihood of us doing like an extensive tour is very low, but the likelihood of us playing some select shows coinciding with some kind of release that will happen in the short to medium term is very high. Yeah.
Beautiful. And final question. Have you ever thought about releasing like maybe a book or a series of bass videos going over your playing style or anything like that?
Not really, man, because it's like, if you start peeling back layers of the onion, I mean, it's like I can make the shit sound good, but it's if I try to convey it to people, everybody's gonna be like, wow, this dude does not know how to play bass correctly at all. That's not
Well,
the only.
fair enough.
I don't know. I mean, it's just like, I think like I'm gonna try to phrase this in a way which, like, I play bass in a quirky way, and the way that the style that I've come to, I have in informal settings tried to convey to people a number of times, and tried to do it earnestly, you know, and tried to be like, oh no, it's like if you do this and you do this, it's kind of like this. But it's really it's like pretty odd the way I play. And I do a lot of things kind of incorrectly, and they work well for me. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm lucky enough that I have like good enough technique and good enough sort of like melodic sense and rhythmic sense that it carries over. But to like convey it in a formalized way has never been particularly appealing to me. That may change, but it's like I'm like not one of those dudes. I'm like not one of those dudes that ever aspires to be like, hey, time to go to Nam, you know.
No, for
Like,
sure. I
you know,
gotcha.
my shit's much more just like I'd rather talk about, I don't know. I'd rather talk about like other shit.
Fair
But who knows?
enough.
That may change. Who knows?
Well, hey man, thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate you coming on. I mean, I've always been a really huge fan of your playing, so it was an honor to be able to speak with you.
And well, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Keep on dreaming. See you next week.